So the first thing you want to do is know yourself. And what we mean by that is that you want to know your genetics. So there's a couple ways to, test and get an idea without being real invasive. I mean, you can go over and you can get a biopsy, or instead you can do a jump test. And in the jump test, basically what you do is you would reach up, and you can see whether you are more explosive or less explosive. You can reach up on a chart, and the chart will have a measurement, and see how far you can reach to start with. And then wherever you reach to, then you leap up, jump up as high as you can, and touch again. And the difference between those two, between where you first reached and where you last reached, will tell you how high you were able to explode and jump. And that will give you an indication of how explosive your muscle tissue is, at least in your legs. And that'll give you an idea of whether you're more likely to be a sprinter. So the more explosive you are, the more likely to be towards a sprint type of activity. Doesn't mean you have to swim that, but it is going to be more likely. Whereas if you are less explosive, then more likely to be a distance style swimmer. And then you can kind of be all in different areas on that. So you want to kind of check and see, where you are on that. And then you also want to, and that helps you to determine the type of muscle, where it's red muscle tissue or more white muscle tissue. More white muscle tissue means you're more explosive. More red muscle tissue, a little bit less explosive. And that's your genetic predisposition. Now, let's say, and I had a friend of mine who trained because he was on a team, and that team always trains distance swimmers. That's kind of their thing. Everybody there, they're going to go a lot of long distance. So he trained his whole life to be, if this makes sense, a distance swimmer. However, it's in America. In America, there's very little chance genetically, if you look at our genetic pool, because we're a melting pot, right? And there's very little chance that all the genetics in one area is going to be the same. Maybe somewhere on an island that has been totally cut off from the rest of the world, maybe get a similar genetic pool, but not in America. And so we have very different genetic pools. So all the kids on that team were trained to be endurance style athletes. He had a very tough time because then he went down and he swam, and he was a good distance athlete for Clemson University. And then on the last swim of his career in college, they said, hey, why don't you just jump in and swim 100 free just for fun? And he did, and it was devastating to him because he found out that he was an amazing sprinter. His whole life he was a great sprinter, and he was genetically set up that way. And then all of a sudden, they didn't recognize it because he had always trained for distance. So he had actually, when you train for distance, your sprint recedes, and your ability to sprint. When you train for sprint, your endurance recedes somewhat. So in that case, he had always trained himself against his genetic predisposition, and he was very good. But he would have been an amazing sprinter. And he realized that at that moment. It was very difficult for him to deal with, realizing that his whole time and his whole career he was training for something that he really wasn't as genetically predisposed to. Okay, so you want to kind of get a feeling before you go into all this training and spend all this time. You kind of want to know what you're designed for to start with. One of the things that we want to talk about is our holistic approach for in-water training. And so we want to look at the athlete, we want to understand more about them, we want to deal with the psychological and emotional aspects, because there's a lot of emotional aspects to training. And if you don't deal with that side, you're only dealing with the body as a machine, and right, in that case, you've got a little bit of a confusion, because the emotional aspect is very important to get the emotional energy charged to be able to do the type of training you need to get major gains and make major progress. So the first thing that you want to ask yourself is, what knowledge level will I need to have? If I'm going to be a fitness swimmer, then a low knowledge level might be fine, right? If you're going to be kind of somebody that's going to be competitive, in that case, you're going to have a moderate knowledge level, and that'll work. But if you want to be a high performance swimmer and really make major moves and use swimming as a vehicle to get somewhere, versus just kind of be on a team and be someone who is happy with practice and things like this and having fun with the other kids, that's fine. But that's more of like a hobbyist. But a high performance swimmer is using swimming as a vehicle. In that case, and they're trying to get to, win the next big meet, or they're trying to get to college and swim, or travel, become famous, things like that. If you're trying to use it for that, you need a high level of knowledge. Then you want to ask yourself, what's your specialty stroke, which is pretty simple, right? And what distances do you prefer to swim? So just because you're genetically predisposed to being maybe a sprint athlete, doesn't mean you can't train yourself to be a distance or a middle distance athlete. And sometimes that desire to do that is going to bring a lot of energy, again, emotional energy to the game, and that may help a lot. Sometimes it's good to match it up to find out. Just good to be knowledgeable about it. Okay, so then you want to find out what are your baseline capabilities. And what that means, in comparison to other swimmers that I want to beat, I feel my endurance level is lower, higher, right, or equivalent to the athletes I want to beat. And same thing with speed. So, is my speed lower, higher, or equivalent to those who I want to beat? And also my explosivity. So these are three, right? We have endurance, we have speed, and explosivity. And we want to know, where do I sit compared to the people that I want to beat? And this is just an estimate, so you're just trying to get a feeling for that. So then you're going to get general race characteristics. So from a scale of 1 to 5, do I prefer to be, am I preferring to be more of a, or do I feel like, right, and 1 being the weakest, 5 being the strongest, do I feel like I'm more of a distance style swimmer? Am I predisposed to that, middle distance or sprint? And what part of the race am I strongest in? Am I strongest in the beginning of the race? Am I strongest in the middle, in the end, right? And what part of the race are you absolutely weakest in? And you realize, I'm really not I'm not able to bring the race home. Now that may have to do with pacing, or it may have to do with your endurance and your capability to endure, or how fast you can get out, right? And that can go back to training, and it can go back to predisposition. So we want to make sure we know ourselves a little bit more than just kind of getting a feeling and going.